So I shall probably start with an idea that I initiated this research thinking about what is socialist and socialist modernism. And I would suggest, or I would propose to look at it from the social point of view. From the point of view, what does the socialist society need, and how these needs of socialist society are solved with architecture, and how the new socialist society can be shaped through architecture, and how the new traditions are formed. So when I talk about wedding and funeral palaces in Soviet Lithuania, first of all I meet the challenge because architect had to create spaces, secular spaces, designed to offer appropriate settings for weddings and funerals, while avoiding any kind of religious presence. However, it seems that tradition, in a very broad sense, influenced the new architectural spaces created to practice these new socialist rituals. And on one hand, they represent socialist architecture, since they were purpose-built to serve the Soviet society, and therefore they cannot be researched apart from the ideological motives. On the other hand, artistically, they represent very elaborate buildings of late socialism, or even socialist mannerism, if I can introduce this term. They have very clear artistic program to create an emotional impact. And in this presentation, I will argue that these buildings were substitutes, certain substitutes for sacral spaces. For example, a wedding palace substituted the Soviet church, whereas a funeral palace was an interpretation of cemetery chapel. So I look at them as certain simulacra, filled with surplus meanings and decorations. It's interesting also that although first socialist rituals were introduced in post-war Russia in early 20s, but most of the Soviet initiation rituals date only from the 60s. And this atheist, new wave of atheist policy was especially strong in Soviet Lithuania because of the rather influential Catholic Church that was very active in the resistance movement after the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states. Compared to the direct fight against the church in Stalinist period, during the Khrushchev's era, policy changed to a more sophisticated one, in creating attractive substitutes for the church, like song festivals, youth events, and introducing new traditions based on the so-called ethnographic origin. So it explains why special purpose designed buildings began to spread out in many Soviet republics only from late 60s, 70s onwards. For example, here's an example. There was created this Lithuanian Board of National Tradition, which was established in early 60s. And it published a book, Civil Ceremonies, in 69. However, there were no pictures to illustrate that book, since there were no purpose buildings or interiors yet. But the new version of the book, published 10 years later in 79, is full of colorful pictures of the new ritual buildings and halls and interiors. So in this context, the Soviet Lithuania plays an experimental place, I can say it, because the first purpose-built wedding palace in Vilnius and funeral palace in Vilnius served as prototypes of functional type and modernist aesthetics for the entire Soviet Union. Why is it important? Because in many Soviet cities and towns, institutions for civil marriage registration, called ZAKs, were simply placed in the rooms at the municipalities or collective farm clubs, or arranged in the rooms on the ground floor apartment houses. It was the only place where a couple could be married officially. So Communist Party ideologists strongly believed that people go to church because of the emotional reasons. Therefore, emotional impact was one of the goals of the new ritual buildings, to attract people from church to new places. And in the early 60s, a new kind of civil marriage registration bureaus started to be established in beautiful historic buildings, showing the importance of architectural environment to create a more festive surroundings and environments. However, one might say that a proper architectural building for the Soviet wedding was not yet clearly defined. Therefore, this construction for the first purpose-designed and purpose-built palace for civil wedding ceremony in Vilnius is both exceptional and illustrative, because in the case of weddings, what used to be the mere registration of a marriage, it had to become an elaborate ceremony. And its founding is very well evidenced by the second secretary of the Lithuanian Communist Party complaining that there are no beautiful buildings for marriage registration in the capital city. Therefore, people go to marry to the church. And soon the plot was found on the former Lutheran cemetery, and a young modernist architect was commissioned to design a building with no financial restrictions. And the idea of this architect was to design a really modern type of building that was never seen before, and that would combine the function of the town hall or the Rathaus, something of this, with the church. Some mixed building, but never seen before. And actually, this very building was contemporary and elegant appropriation of Western late modernism, employing structural shape and a concept of developing building which expands into the surrounding park. But much more interesting and important to my mind was the organization of the interior, because the architect had to design not only the building but the ceremony itself, and it had to arrange the flows of people through the architecturally defined spaces and create essentially new dramaturgy for the Soviet wedding. And functionally, architect separated the festive part of the first floor, where he directed the flow of people, starting from the symbolic bridge staircase, leading through the waiting and ceremonial hall, and back to the staircase, leaving the hall as newlyweds, as you can see in the picture. Here is this ceremony, how it directed through all the rooms and halls. And all the administrative procedures were located on the ground floor, which was little seen from the outside. The interior of this modernist building was decorated with monumental arts, specially designed furniture and textile decoration, and it is interesting that design of the sculptural ritual table, which you can see here in this wedding hall, really reminds of the church altar or similar structure. And furniture designer remembers that the registration of the marriage at this table emotionally should have equaled to the marriage of the altar in the church. Both halls were also decorated with stained glass, and the choice why the stained glass also can remind of the traditional thinking or traditional perception of the church back wall. Also, you can see some monumental and modern arts of textile and specially designed furniture in the vestibule or in the lobby. These four textile compositions were called morning, day, evening, and night, and also had this existential symbolic, as you can see. And there were two festive halls, one for wedding registration and one for the newborn child registration or the naming ceremony. And the building was really a great success, featured in the Soviet All-Union papers and in the catalog of the best Soviet buildings in the year 1975. In other towns of Lithuania, it became a rule, or it started a new tradition, that palace of weddings should be specially designed and built as a separate, impressive building where architects could use their imagination, either in employing their knowledge of latest Western architectural ideas, as you can see in Klaipėda, or reusing the heritage in creating combined buildings. As you can see, one of the first reuse projects, Palace of Weddings in Anykščiai, where the architect reused the former cemetery chapel. But it was reused rather in a interpreted in a rather post-modern way. A closed cemetery chapel was partly covered and extended with glass annexes. However, this macabre tendency to create places for civil marriage on the grounds of cemeteries or former cemeteries, I think, needs to be investigated more thoroughly in the future. So you can see several interiors of these halls where, for the smaller times, the type design of this ritual table was introduced and used in many other places. So here you can see the photo artist Vilma Samulionytė, who shared these pictures with me. I'm very happy. She's making this project. She photographed all 59 wedding parlors in Lithuania as a separate project. And you can see this very special design with specially designed furniture or stained glass again, or more modest moments and stained glass again, or sculptural compositions, or here the ceiling decoration and specially designed carpet, as you can see. So, whereas these wedding palaces became rather common in many Soviet republics, the buildings designed for funerals might be seen as a local specificity in Lithuania, again, probably because of the strong Catholic tradition, because funeral homes were also initiated the same by the party requirements to create new halls where the secular ceremony of farewell ceremony can be carried on. And the ideas behind these buildings were extraordinarily strange, because architects again needed to invent original new types of buildings that did not have any tradition. I'm really happy that yesterday Sharka showed me that book about the mourning halls in Czech Republic, so I think there can be some parallels. Here are the first instructions for architects how to arrange these halls in existing buildings or in public buildings before the first funeral palaces as separate buildings were built. And it's interesting that again, the first secular funeral, of course, was introduced in Soviet Union just after the revolution, and it included the combination of crematorium and a ritual hall nearby, or a mourning hall, or a farewell hall. It was named differently. And I think this story of the first crematorium in Moscow at Donskoye Cemetery presents a chrestomatic case of Soviet iconoclasm in the form of reuse of the cemetery church. It is well known that none of the Orthodox nor Catholic tradition saw it acceptable to cremate a body. So from this point of view, crematorium served also as a modernist way to do with bodies, yeah, but also as a tool of atheism in the society. And here are several designs how to convert the church of San Serafim Sarovsky and Anna Kaczynska into crematorium. And here's the interior, you can see, and only in 2000 it was reconstructed back to the church. Nevertheless, not a single crematorium was built in Soviet Lithuania during the Soviet times and afterwards. The first crematorium is only considered to be built now after 2010. It's very strong opposition to the cremation of a body. So this ritual of funeral was especially respected with a very deep existential feelings and emotions. Therefore, this first building for secular funeral services in Lithuania is rather long and complicated. And the commissioner, the Ministry of Consumer Services, first of all requested a building with purely secular function for the party or nomenclature funerals. And the young architect was commissioned. He was just finished his studies in '66, and also he saw it as a very big challenge because he said in his interview that he never seen anything before in his life. Only he could look at the Czech magazines to look at Czech crematoria, but it shouldn't be a crematorium. So from the very beginning, it was clear that the building should be special and it shouldn't have any religious connotations or associations. So he relied on developing universal existential symbols of the life. And for example, here you can see in his first designs, the visitor should enter through a monumental portal and a tight corridor from which one reaches a hall with a huge glass wall facing the woods. But to architect's regret, his idea about this road to eternity did not get approval. Ideas of folk architecture were also considered, but finally the ideas of the modernist church design as references to icons of the international modernism, such as Ronchamp Chapel, of course, by Le Corbusier, or St. Mary's Cathedral by Kenzo Tange. I'm happy to repeat Kenzo Tange again in this audience, that were admired by Lithuanian architects as well as by other socialist modernist architects at the time. And this palace of ritual service, as it was called afterwards, received very positive response from the authorities and in the media, and architect later received the commission to make an extension. And here you can see the interior design. I will come later for the interior. Here is the first part, and here is the extension. For the funeral home in Kaunas, in another big, second largest city in Lithuania, architect Alfredas Paulauskas in '78 also looked for an emotional and original aesthetic expression, and these curved blank walls were one of the most popular solutions, seeking to transform these boring modernist boxes. But the wavy shape of the facade was, however, just an imitation of the structural freedom provided by reinforced concrete. In this building, the walls were made of bricks and coated with a coarse patterned plaster. And interior, also, for the emotional impact, there was this sculptural group near the facade called Sorrow, which also referred to this. And for the interior, you can also see the special design of lighting and furniture. It's interesting that emotional impact of these buildings is only seen in the interiors and front part of the buildings. But the layout of the rear parts, number 4, it's compared Vilnius and Kaunas palaces, the garages, all the services really show the practical needs of the official ceremonial principles and all these needs. So this, according to the consumer services requirements, these funeral homes had to offer a complete range of services, from document management to artistic assistance in choosing funeral accessories and transportation from funeral homes to the cemetery. One important thing that these funeral houses were never built in cemeteries, but in the city centers, and they were never attached to cemeteries. Smaller towns also built their funeral homes a little bit later, and this aesthetic and details are again rather strange, as this type designed for 3 Lithuanian towns in Klaipėda, Šiauliai, and Panevėžys, designed by architect who also combined some monumentality that can be seen as an Egyptian, combined with folk art. And these 2 halls, there are 2 smaller and bigger funeral halls. But also you can see the combination of ethnic architecture. Yeah, and stained glass again used in all of these buildings. So in the final conclusion, I would like to make to share some thoughts also maybe for the further discussion, because looking in the broader context, these new ritual buildings with their own symbolics and are clearly close to the functional type of cemetery chapels that were rather widespread in the West. But in comparison to other objects of consumer services like shopping malls or other things, they demonstrate very expressive architecture and interior design. So architects did not escape much from the tradition in designing these new types of ritual buildings. They can be seen as combining the suppressed ideas of the modernist church design as well as the national idiom, and these can be interpreted as rather symbolic architectural phenomenon of the socialist architecture. Another important aspect is that during the entire Soviet period, no church was allowed to be built in strongly Catholic Lithuania. So in this context, it was very different from the neighboring Poland, which witnessed a real boom of modern churches, especially in the last decades of socialism. So from this point of view, it might be seen that Lithuanian architects designed these buildings as a sublimation of sacral architecture. Why this inventiveness? Why there are so many inventive interior things and they are also all so original and unique? So out of the poverty, the answer would be because the lack of materials and technologies forced these modern architects to do many things by hand and to reuse or adapt many different ready-made objects or elaborate plasters, but done by hand, cladding, lighting, furniture, but why this strive for originality or uniqueness? It is also seems to be the reaction of the functionalism or boxes or glass boxes of the 60s as a reaction that comes in the 70s. But also we must see the difference between what architectural historian David Crowley has called Socialist Modernism 1 and Socialist Modernism 2. So Socialist Modernism 1 is that banal modernism of type design, like prefabricated housing, shopping malls, kindergartens and school, and Socialist Modernism 2, all these specially designed things that we have seen in the spas, in the sanatoriums, and in these wedding palaces. So in this discussion about Soviet or socialist modernism, one could argue that there were not so many differences between the socialist and the Western modernism if we look at the appearance or exteriors. So what constitutes this socialist content of modernism? If it's not the style, then what is it? So maybe it is even not a question of architecture. I would argue that it must be special types of buildings that were originally created to serve the socialist lifestyle. Therefore, wedding palaces and funeral palaces might be one of these. Live the tradition.
Thank you very much, Marija, for the presentation. For me personally, it was really interesting because in Czech Republic, the wedding palace as a specific building doesn't exist. We had only at the town hall specific room. But if I'm not making any mistake, I don't know how it's in Slovakia, but if there is, in context of Czechoslovakia, if there is specific wedding palace, maybe yes, but in Czech Republic there is only room, so it's very...
One of my ideas when I applied to this conference to check in all different countries, because it's different in all countries as far as I know.
In contrary, the funeral houses or mourning halls are very common and interesting building in Czechoslovakian context, and there were competition which was never realized, but it was competition for the design as a to create a typology, like to make a serial production of the same, which was never realized. But we have documentation for this competition, that it was announced and probably was the competition, but the buildings are not built. So many questions.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I will just limit myself to 2 questions. The first one, I thought that image of the wedding palace, the first wedding palace that you showed in Vilnius, I think. And there was this whole dramaturgy of 11 rooms that the newlyweds have to go through. Do you mind giving me a short tour, what they do in each and every room?
So they start during this bridge, elevation, and then they go to the room where they give their papers for the
Number
administrator. Number 9, I think. Yeah, number 9.
Okay. Yeah.
Then the number 8 and number 7 are separate rooms for men and women. The last decision room, as it said. But the room for women had mirrors, so she can prepare before the final ceremony. And the room for males somehow didn't, because maybe it was happy to have any man to get married. So then they wait in the room, open room number 6, until they will be invited. And the door opens, and they are invited into the hall with the stained glass in the back. And here they are registered officially.
Number 1.
Number 1, yes. And then they go they can go to room number 3 for the photographs. And they can also go to room number 4 when they leave, just for a glass of champagne. It was introduced. And in the back there is glass wall again, you can see the woods. And the same ceremony is for the registration of childbirth. So finally they make this circle and go back as newlyweds.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And my second question is, so you said that this was architecture for the needs of a socialist society that competes in some ways with the church. Can you give me some indication of how successful the architecture and this whole dramaturgy was in competing with them?
Very successful. It was the tradition that urban population goes to marry in these palaces, and only the rural population from smaller villages traditionally go to church, but then they must go again to the palace for registration, or to the parlor, because in the church they couldn't be officially registered as a couple.
So there's a noticeable, is there any data of like church rituals going down in numbers after these palaces have been built?
After the 90s, after their independence, there was a big boom going back to church, and only the these palaces in bigger cities surviving now.
Yeah.
Because others are not needed anymore, because there's a big palaces.
Thank you.
So I found it really interesting to see another transformation of spirituality into materialism in the social context. It's very interesting always to see something like that, because it's some sort of like an old habit to have spirituality, and then we always have to transform into materialism. And it's very interesting to see that, and to have some sort of root from the architecture of the church. And another a question would be from me is that I've heard many opinions that, I heard it sometimes that Western architects were very interested in what's going on the east side, and how our, for example, comic blocks are built and so on. And they were told that these buildings are sort of a tool for a reproduction machine in the social countries. And it seems to be that the first step of the reproduction machines are these wedding palaces. Do you agree with it, or is it something like...
Well, it might be as a hypothesis, but I can't see that maybe I fully agree. Did I understand correctly that you said that Western architects were interested in socialist buildings?
Yes, yes.
Because I suppose the opposite story, as far as I know. But
well, they were just interested in what's going on, why are the buildings are built in that way, and so on. At the same time,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Are interested in that very much as an exoticism.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an exotic spaces and buildings. Yeah, I think that's out of that. That's the reason.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. It's so cool, actually. I'm so impressed. It's like building Catholic churches without crosses in the Soviet Union. It's so cool. I have a question, only one question. What happens to these buildings now? Like, I can believe that, I can understand that there is a Catholic church comeback, but is there still population that uses them? What happens to architecture? What are the plans? Are there any, I don't know, special? I can imagine that some of them were converted into churches. Did that happen, or were they closed? Like, if you could just tell me a few words about this, that would be super interesting.
Pictures are contemporary. As you can see, so these parlors are used, but they are used in much smaller scales. The buildings are used very differently, as I mentioned, only in bigger towns like Vilnius, Kaunas, Klaipėda. But for example, this one building is listed. It's not used, but it's listed, and now it stays abandoned. The same as Vilnius wedding palace is listed, so it's put on the protection of national cultural heritage, but the new mayor of Vilnius wants to take everything out of this and to establish the civil marriage ceremony hall in the town hall, in the Rathaus. So, but what is he going to do with this building where everything is protected and it's very functionally designed and all the art pieces are protected as integral part? How is he going to reuse it for new functions? It's really a new challenge, I think. But in Vilnius, people love this place and they still go there.
Yeah, my question would be, you showed us very different exteriors, very individual. We know it existed in a lot of countries, like even Republic of Georgia, very famous wedding house, or even in Muslim countries like Kyrgyzstan. So my question would be, you showed us that the interior, the ground floor, Grundriss, I don't know, the floor map is kind of similar because it follows a certain ritual. So when the inside is Soviet in this Soviet ritual, did you compare different wedding palaces in different countries? Can you say that maybe the interior is similar in Republic of Georgia to Lithuania to Kyrgyzstan, where even, I mean, you have different religions, but the interior is, do you know anything about that?
I haven't seen much myself, only from this Frederick Chopin book. There are many photographs. But I would say that the common tradition is that exterior is rather modernist, but interior is more strange. For example, as you can see here, that it's a modernist building. But the individuality or originality or uniqueness of the project is common feature everywhere. Here is this Georgian Tbilisi wedding palace, which is not a wedding palace anymore, but very sculptural architecture, very individual design. And I would say that it requires that it's not a standard design, but a unique design for each building.
Yes, this is on here. That was even my question. There was no central guideline for the design. Were these churches, these glass windows, renovated, or was this original Soviet? Because I can't believe that you had no central socialist symbols in the windows everywhere, and that this was just individual creation of an architect. I can't believe it. And what is the sense of this? And I can't believe that they gave the architects that freedom to create the interior design from in their own view, or after their own ideas. I think is there no central guideline for Moscow or somewhere? What has to be seen there, or are these just? I can't believe that this is just art from an architect or something. Or were this all renovated buildings? Thank you.
Well, I think you are guided by stereotypes, because starting from the modernist, Khrushchev's thought, modernism is not restricted anymore, and at least what party officials require from new generation of architects, you know that it's the cult of youth, and the new specialists are commissioned to design new buildings. At least when I did many interviews with those architects, all of them said we could do whatever we wanted, because they required from us new modern ideas, because socialist modernism had to be contemporary, new, original, and starting from that period, we don't have so many restrictions or directives from Moscow in the republics, not anymore. But there are, of course, financial restrictions, and if we should divide Sotsmodernism, one, the type design, which is very strongly directed by the normatives, those SNPs, so planning norms and rules. But in the special commissions, it is usually the commissioner and the architect, and they decide. So it's and why there are no socialist symbols in the wedding palaces? Because socialist symbols are not emotional. They don't create emotional impact, and they are not so important anymore. The only thing was this, how you call it, herb, coat of arms of the Republic, that it's an official institution, that's all.
You told us that you're coming to this topic is your search for the socialist content of it. But nowadays societies also are declining with religions uses. What would be your recommendation for nowadays non-religious societies to find rooms for their rituals? For remembrance, in Germany, after unification, one of the very, very few specialties of East German behavior and lifestyle that has been surviving is such a non-religious ritual for youth growing up, the Jugendweihe. And now I think there will the question what to offer to people for this personal rituals, it is necessary in other societies too, not only in socialists.
Of course, I must declare that I don't have any recommendations, but I have some thoughts about it, because I think it's a much broader context. What I'm interested now is a broader context of atheism and architecture. Because it's not only the introduction of new palaces, but there are all these substitutes. There was a very good research that published this spring in Lithuania about introducing atheism in Soviet Lithuania, but through not direct ban of church, but through those sophisticated ways like substitutes, etc. And the conclusion was that it produced neither atheist nor Catholic, but indifferent person. And with indifferent person, you don't know what it needs. Because what he's offered, only then you can see its reaction or you don't know his or her expectations. It doesn't know how to behave in the community. It's very individual, and it's a society of very individual persons. So I can only share this conclusion of academic research. But what about the spaces? It's probably the town hall.
Yeah, my question would be that you mentioned that these so these funeral houses were never attached to cemeteries. And I find it really interesting because on the other hand, you mentioned that they really remained at this type of funeral in which the body was very important. And I think that it's very strange that they chose this attachment from the cemetery, although the burial of the body itself was very important to them. And so what happened then in the cemetery? Like, for me, funeral is so much attached to the cemetery. I find it really interesting how they...
Entire way, all this company of people going all together from the funeral house to the cemetery and then to this burial ceremony.
But then so why did they choose not to build these buildings next to the
I
cemetery?
should find out because I don't know yet.
Okay.
Maybe the comment from that I don't know how was the tradition before, but usually the way going through the city with the dead body as a ceremonial process to enter the cemetery in many countries, how to say, the South European countries is very common, like the tradition that you enter your house and going with the procession to the church and then to the cemetery. Maybe this can be connection. Are there any?
Just a small comment. So for me was the question of the symbolic too very interesting. That no symbolic is in these buildings, but I think if you and no didactic. But if you take from such a building the religion, then remains only didactic and only ideologism. So you don't need anything, and yes, it's quite interesting that the architecture itself, the altar and the space structure remains as didactic only, I think.
Because form follows function.
Yeah, there is another question.
I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that this palace is supposed to replace churches. And if nowadays actually it happens back again, like the churches replace these places, and because it was like church without Christian symbols, but so it's easy adaptable to church.
Yeah, but there is no any example yet that this palace should be reconstructed or reused for the church. That would be a good suggestion.
I just mentioned it because we have these examples in Slovakia, as you was asking. I know at least about 2 examples that in 60s was construction started, as was said, that it's going to be like a cultural house, or what we can say like ceremony palace, but it was finished already like church, so even expanded by socialist money. So.
And I would like to ask about the mourning halls. It was situated in city center, close to main square, or somewhere in the outside suburbs, or?
It's not situated in the city center. This one, as you can see, near the river and surrounded by woods, it was not very far from the cemetery, but this one was also in the woods on the hill. Something like really landscape design was used to support this impact of emotional and separation.